He thought calling her nobody would end everything, but he had no idea it was only the beginning of his downfall. The courtroom of Jefferson County stood in polished silence, sunlight pouring through 12-foot windows and stretching across the marble floor like a quiet witness to what was about to unfold. Judge William Harrington sat elevated behind the bench, his tailored navy robe perfectly pressed, his expression carved from years of authority and unchecked confidence. People said he had ruled over more than 3,000 cases in his 20-year career, and in every one of them, his word had been final. No one questioned him. No one challenged him. And certainly, no one like her. Emily Carter stood alone at the defense table, her presence almost invisible against the grandeur of the room. At 38, she wore a simple gray cardigan over a white blouse, her hair neatly tied back, her posture composed but unassuming. To most in that room, she looked like someone who had wandered into the wrong place, someone who didn't understand how things worked at this level. A few spectators in the gallery exchanged quiet glances, their eyes drifting over her as if already deciding her outcome before a single word was spoken. Harrington glanced down at the file in front of him, barely masking his disinterest. "Miss Carter," he began, his voice echoing with controlled impatience, "you've been brought here on a procedural matter that should have been resolved weeks ago. Yet here we are." His tone carried the weight of judgment long before any ruling. Emily didn't respond. She simply listened. That, more than anything, seemed to irritate him. The clerk shifted slightly beside the bench, flipping through documents, while a faint cough echoed somewhere in the back of the room. The air felt tight, like something invisible was pressing in on everyone present. Harrington leaned forward, resting his hands on the polished wood. "Let me make this very clear," he continued, his voice lowering just enough to demand attention. "This court does not entertain unnecessary delays or misunderstandings from individuals who fail to grasp basic legal procedures." A subtle chuckle came from somewhere in the gallery, quickly stifled but not unnoticed. Emily's eyes remained steady, fixed not on the judge, but somewhere just beyond him, as if she were seeing something others couldn't. It was a small detail, easy to miss, but it didn't belong in someone who was supposed to be intimidated. Harrington noticed. And for a brief second, something flickered across his face. Doubt? No. He dismissed it instantly. He had seen this before, people trying to appear composed before everything unraveled. "You're wasting this court's time," he said sharply, each word landing with deliberate weight. The room grew quieter. Even the faint shuffling stopped. And then, with a thin smile that barely concealed his contempt, he delivered the line that would echo far beyond that moment. "You're nobody, Miss Carter." The words hung in the air like a verdict. A few heads in the gallery tilted, watching closely now, waiting for the reaction they expected: embarrassment, panic, defeat. But Emily Carter didn't flinch. She didn't lower her gaze. She didn't move at all. For exactly 3 seconds, nothing happened. And in that silence, something shifted. The silence did not break the way everyone expected. It did not crack into whispers or nervous laughter. It deepened, thick and deliberate, as if the room itself was waiting for something unseen to arrive. Emily Carter slowly lifted her eyes, not with defiance, not with anger, but with a quiet certainty that did not belong to someone who had just been dismissed as nothing. Her voice, when it came, was calm, almost gentle. "Your Honor," she said, each word clear and measured, "before you proceed, I would like to clarify one point for the record." A faint shift moved through the courtroom. The clerk paused mid-motion, a pen hovering above paper. In the gallery, a man in a dark suit leaned forward slightly, his curiosity replacing earlier amusement. Judge Harrington exhaled through his nose, the faintest sign of irritation returning to his features. He had expected hesitation, perhaps even silence. Not this. Not composure. "This is not a debate," he replied, his tone clipped. "This is a ruling." Emily did not move. Respectfully, she said, her gaze steady now, meeting his directly for the first time, a ruling must be based on a complete interpretation of the law. That sentence landed differently. It was not loud. It was not aggressive. But it carried weight. The kind of weight that did not ask for attention, yet commanded it anyway. Harrington's fingers tapped once against the wooden bench, a subtle rhythm that betrayed a growing impatience. "And you believe this court is incomplete in its interpretation?" he asked, his voice edged with disbelief. A few heads turned again, watching closely now, sensing that something had shifted beyond the surface of a routine proceeding. Emily took a small breath, not out of nervousness, but as if aligning her thoughts with precision. "I believe," she said, "that context matters." The words echoed softly across the chamber. The fluorescent lights hummed faintly above, the only sound daring to interrupt the tension. Harrington leaned back slightly, studying her now, not as an inconvenience, but as something he had not yet fully measured. It was subtle, but it was there. "Go on," he said finally, though the permission sounded more like a challenge. Emily nodded once. "In your previous ruling on March 12, she began, her tone steady, "you cited section 14.3 to justify discretionary dismissal. However, that section does not stand alone." The clerk's pen touched paper again, slower this time. More deliberate. Harrington's expression remained firm, but his eyes narrowed just slightly. "It is directly limited by subsection C," Emily continued, "which states that discretionary authority is suspended when prior procedural inconsistencies are present in the case record." A murmur, faint but undeniable, moved through the gallery. Someone shifted in their seat. Another leaned closer, as if trying to hear more clearly. Harrington's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "And in this case," Emily said, her voice still calm, still controlled, "those inconsistencies were filed, under your own directive." The room did not just grow quiet. It stopped. Completely. Even the air felt still. For a moment, Judge Harrington did not respond. His hand remained on the bench, but the confidence that had filled the room just moments ago no longer sat as comfortably on his shoulders. And for the first time since the hearing began, he was not in complete control. The words did not echo loudly, but they carried farther than anything else that had been said in that room. For a brief moment, no one moved. The clerk's pen hovered above the page, frozen as if unsure whether to continue writing or wait for something more. Judge Harrington remained still, his posture unchanged, but something behind his eyes shifted, subtle and controlled, like a calculation being forced to adjust mid-process. He looked down at the file in front of him, then back at Emily Carter, as though measuring her again, this time with a precision he had not considered necessary before. "That is a selective interpretation," he replied finally, his voice steady, but no longer effortless. It required intention now. Effort. Emily did not react to the challenge. "It is a complete interpretation," she said quietly. "The limitation is written directly beneath the section you referenced." A faint rustle passed through the gallery. Someone flipped a page. Another leaned closer, eyes narrowing, as if trying to follow along with something they had previously ignored. Harrington's fingers pressed slightly into the edge of the bench. "This court is well aware of its own rulings," he said, the authority returning to his tone, but not quite as absolute as before. Emily inclined her head slightly. "Then you are also aware," she continued, "that subsection C was amended 2 years ago to address precisely this type of procedural oversight." The word oversight lingered. It was not accusatory. It was not loud. But it landed with weight. The clerk shifted again, this time flipping more deliberately through a stack of documents, eyes scanning lines with growing focus. Harrington's gaze followed the movement for a fraction of a second, then returned to Emily. "And you are suggesting," he said slowly, "that this court has overlooked its own amendment?" There it was. Not denial. Not dismissal. A question. Emily's expression did not change. "I am stating," she said, her voice calm and even, "that the amendment applies here." Another silence fell, but it was different now. It was no longer passive. It was charged. The kind of silence that builds when people begin to realize they may have missed something important. A man in the second row adjusted his glasses, his earlier skepticism replaced by something closer to attention. A woman near the aisle leaned forward, her eyes fixed on Emily with a new kind of curiosity. Harrington glanced down again, this time longer, scanning the page in front of him with a focus that had not been there before. The confidence that once filled the space around him had not disappeared, but it had shifted, becoming sharper, more cautious. Even if that were the case, he said, lifting his head again, it would not change the validity of this proceeding. Emily took a small step forward, not aggressive, not confrontational, but deliberate. It would, she said, if the procedural inconsistencies were documented prior to your ruling. The clerk stopped flipping pages. Completely. The pen lowered slowly onto the desk. Harrington's jaw tightened again, more visibly this time. "And you have evidence of that?" he asked. Emily held his gaze. "Yes, Your Honor." The room did not breathe. Not one person shifted. Not one sound interrupted the moment. Because for the first time, it was no longer clear who was standing on stronger ground. And somewhere in that silence, the balance of the entire courtroom began to tilt. The word yes did not sound loud, but it landed with a force that no one in the courtroom could ignore. Judge Harrington leaned back slightly, his eyes fixed on Emily Carter, no longer dismissive, no longer certain. "Then President," he said, his voice controlled, though a faint edge had begun to surface beneath it. Emily did not rush. She reached calmly into the folder resting on the table in front of her, her movements precise, unhurried, as if every second unfolding was exactly where it was meant to be. The sound of paper sliding against paper seemed louder than it should have been, amplified by the stillness that had settled over the room. She lifted a single document, then another, aligning them carefully. Before placing them on the table. "Filed on February 27th, she said, her tone steady, under case reference JH 2147. The clerk's eyes widened slightly as the number registered. His hand moved almost automatically toward his own records, flipping pages with growing urgency. Harrington did not look away from Emily, but his attention was no longer entirely on her. It had begun to divide. "That filing," Emily continued, "documents procedural inconsistencies identified during preliminary review. It was submitted to the court and acknowledged by your office." A faint murmur rippled through the gallery, not loud enough to disrupt, but enough to signal that the shift was no longer subtle. People were no longer observing out of curiosity. They were listening. Harrington's fingers tightened against the edge of the bench. "Acknowledged does not mean validated," he replied, his voice sharper now, reclaiming ground where he could. Emily inclined her head slightly. "Correct," she said. "But it does mean recorded. And once recorded, subsection C applies." The clerk stopped flipping pages. His gaze lifted slowly, meeting the judge's for a brief second before dropping again, as if uncertain whether to speak. That hesitation did not go unnoticed. Harrington's jaw set more firmly. "You are attempting to reinterpret procedural boundaries beyond your authority," he said, each word measured, deliberate, an effort to reassert control over a narrative that was beginning to move without him. Emily did not react to the pressure. "I am referencing the court's own framework," she said quietly. Nothing more. The simplicity of the statement carried its own weight. There was no defiance in it. No arrogance. Just clarity. And that clarity began to echo through the room in a way that made everything else feel less certain. A man near the back shifted in his seat, his earlier posture relaxed, now upright, attentive. Another spectator glanced toward the clerk, then back to Emily, as if trying to piece together something that was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. Harrington finally looked down at the documents before him, really looked this time, his eyes scanning lines with a focus that had replaced his earlier confidence. Seconds passed. Then another. No one spoke. No one moved. Because for the first time since the hearing began, the man who controlled the room was no longer leading it. And Emily Carter, the woman he had dismissed without a second thought, stood exactly where she had been all along, except now, the entire courtroom was beginning to realize they had been looking at her all wrong. The longer Judge Harrington looked at the documents, the quieter the room became, as if every person present understood that something irreversible was unfolding in real time. His eyes moved line by line, slower now, no longer scanning with confidence but searching, verifying, recalculating. The authority that once defined his posture had not disappeared, but it had shifted into something more guarded, more deliberate. Emily Carter remained exactly where she stood, her hands resting lightly against the edge of the table, her expression composed, untouched by the tension that had begun to ripple through the courtroom. She did not press. She did not interrupt. She simply waited. And that silence, that patience, began to speak louder than anything else. The clerk cleared his throat softly, an almost involuntary sound that broke through the stillness. "Your Honor," he said cautiously, his voice lower than before, "the filing, it is here." He turned the page toward the bench, his finger marking a specific line. Harrington's gaze followed immediately, his brow tightening just slightly as he read. A few seconds passed. Then a few more. No one dared to move. Even the faint hum of the overhead lights seemed to fade into the background. Harrington's jaw shifted as he reached the bottom of the page, then returned to the top, reading it again, more carefully this time. When he finally looked up, his expression was not the same one he had worn at the beginning of the hearing. It was not anger. It was not disbelief. It was something quieter, something more dangerous. Awareness. "This does not automatically invalidate the proceeding," he said, his voice steady, but now measured with precision rather than dominance. It was a statement, but it lacked the finality it once carried. Emily inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the point without conceding anything. "No, Your Honor," she replied. "It does not automatically invalidate it." The agreement caught several people off guard. A man in the gallery blinked, as if expecting confrontation and receiving something entirely different. But Emily continued before the moment could settle. "However," she said, her tone unchanged, "it does require the court to reassess whether the conditions for discretionary dismissal were ever valid to begin with." The words landed cleanly, without emphasis, without force, yet they carried a weight that shifted the balance even further. Harrington's fingers pressed together, resting just above the bench, his posture tightening as the implications began to settle into place. "You are suggesting," he said slowly, "that this court acted prematurely." It was not quite an accusation. Not yet. But it was closer than anything he had said before. Emily met his gaze without hesitation. "I am suggesting," she said, "that the timeline matters." Another silence followed, but this one felt different again, deeper, heavier, as if the room itself understood that the ground beneath it had already begun to change. The clerk shifted once more, glancing between the document and the judge, uncertain whether to speak further. A woman in the front row lowered her eyes briefly, then looked back up, her earlier skepticism replaced with something closer to respect. Harrington exhaled slowly, a controlled breath, as he leaned back in his chair, the polished wood creaking faintly beneath the shift. For a moment, he said nothing. And in that moment, the authority he had relied on for years no longer filled the space the same way. Because now, it was no longer unquestioned. And everyone in that courtroom could feel it. The silence stretched longer than anyone expected, no longer uncomfortable but heavy with realization, as if the courtroom itself had begun to absorb the weight of what was unfolding. Judge Harrington's gaze remained fixed on the documents in front of him, but his focus had shifted inward, recalibrating, reassessing, searching for ground that no longer felt as solid as it had minutes ago. When he finally spoke, his voice carried less force and more calculation. "Timelines," he repeated slowly, as if testing the word in a different context. "You believe the sequence of events changes the authority of this court." It was not dismissal. It was engagement. And that alone altered the atmosphere. Emily Carter stood without moving, her posture unchanged, her calm presence now unmistakably deliberate. "Not the authority," she said quietly. "The application of it." The distinction settled into the room with precision. A man near the aisle shifted in his seat, his earlier confidence in the outcome now replaced with uncertainty. The clerk glanced again at the file, then back at the judge, waiting, but not interrupting. Harrington leaned forward slightly, his hands folding together, his tone measured. "Explain," he said. It was a simple word, but it carried something new. "Permission." Emily nodded once, acknowledging it. If procedural inconsistencies were documented before the discretionary decision, she began, her voice steady and controlled, then the condition required for that decision was never fully satisfied. She paused, not for effect, but for clarity. Which means the ruling was not based on incomplete information after the fact. It was based on incomplete information at the time it was made. A subtle shift moved through the gallery. This was no longer about interpretation. This was about foundation. Harrington's expression tightened, not in anger, but in concentration. "And you are asserting that this court failed to account for its own record," he said, choosing each word carefully. Emily met his gaze. "I am stating that the record was present," she replied. "But it was not applied." The distinction was quiet, but it cut deeper than any accusation. The clerk lowered his eyes briefly, his pen resting motionless against the paper. A woman in the front row leaned forward slightly, her attention fully captured now, no trace of earlier doubt remaining. Harrington leaned back again, slower this time, the faint creak of the chair echoing more noticeably in the stillness. For a moment, he said nothing. His eyes moved once more across the document, then stopped, as if landing on something that could not be ignored. When he looked up again, the authority in his posture was still there, but it no longer filled the room alone. It had to share space now. "Even if your argument holds," he said, his voice steady but quieter than before, "it would require this court to reconsider not only this proceeding, but the integrity of its prior decision." The words carried weight. Real weight. Emily did not hesitate. "Yes, Your Honor," she said. No emphasis. No hesitation. Just certainty. The room did not react immediately. It could not. Because what had just been said was no longer a challenge. It was a threshold. And for the first time, it was no longer clear whether Judge Harrington was standing above it, or on the edge of stepping through it himself. The word yes did not echo loudly, but it settled into the courtroom like something permanent, something that could not be taken back. Judge Harrington remained still for a moment longer, his gaze steady on Emily Carter, but no longer from a place of unquestioned authority. It was different now. Focused. Careful. The kind of attention reserved for something that had to be understood, not dismissed. His fingers slowly unclasped, resting flat against the bench as if grounding himself in the weight of the moment. "Reconsideration," he said quietly, almost to himself, as though the word carried more consequence than he had anticipated. The clerk shifted again, this time more deliberately, sliding the document slightly closer to the judge, his eyes lowering as if aware that the smallest movement now carried significance. In the gallery, no one leaned back anymore. Every person sat forward, their earlier assumptions stripped away, replaced by a growing awareness that they were witnessing something rare. Not conflict. Not spectacle. Correction. Harrington lifted his gaze once more, his expression composed, but the certainty that had once defined it now tempered by something else. "Ms. Carter," he said, his voice measured, "you are asking this court to acknowledge that its prior application of the law may have been incomplete." It was not framed as an accusation. It was framed as a possibility. Emily did not hesitate. "I am asking the court to recognize what the record already reflects," she replied, her tone unchanged, steady as before. No challenge. No pressure. Just truth, presented without decoration. The simplicity of it left little room for deflection. Harrington exhaled slowly, his shoulders settling back against the chair, the faint sound of fabric shifting echoing more than it should have. He glanced down again, this time not scanning, but confirming, tracing the sequence of entries, the dates, the references. Each detail aligning with what had already been said. Each detail removing another layer of certainty he had relied on. The clerk finally spoke again, his voice cautious but clear. "Your Honor, the amendment is noted here," he said, tapping lightly against the page. "And the filing precedes the discretionary action by 11 days. 11 days. The number lingered in the air, precise and undeniable. A few people in the gallery exchanged brief looks, not of confusion anymore, but of realization. Harrington's jaw tightened once more, but not in resistance. In acceptance of something that could not be reshaped. 11 days, he repeated quietly. Then he looked up. Not at the clerk. Not at the gallery. At Emily. And for the first time since she had entered the courtroom, there was no trace of dismissal in his gaze. Only recognition. "You reviewed this before appearing today," he said. It was not a question. Emily gave a small nod. "Yes, Your Honor." Another pause followed, shorter this time, but no less significant. Harrington leaned forward again, his posture no longer towering, but deliberate, grounded. "And you understood the implication," he continued. Emily's answer came without hesitation. "Yes." The room did not shift. It held. Because now, everyone understood what had changed. This was no longer about whether she belonged there. That question had already been answered. What remained, was something far more consequential. And Judge Harrington knew it. The realization did not arrive with noise or sudden reaction, it settled quietly, unmistakably, across every face in the courtroom. Judge Harrington remained still, but the stillness was no longer dominance, it was control under pressure. His eyes stayed on Emily Carter, studying her now with a level of attention he had reserved for only the most experienced attorneys who had stood before him over the years. The difference was undeniable. He no longer saw someone out of place. He saw someone prepared. "Then you also understood," he said slowly, each word deliberate, "that raising this argument would force the court into a position of reassessment. It was not resistance. It was acknowledgement disguised as caution." Emily did not shift her stance. "Yes, Your Honor," she replied, her voice calm, grounded, unwavering. The clerk glanced between them again, his earlier uncertainty replaced by something more focused, almost careful, as if he now understood that every word spoken was shaping the outcome in real time. In the gallery, no one moved. No whispers. No shifting. Just attention, complete and undivided. Harrington's gaze dropped once more to the document, but this time it did not linger long. He already knew what it said. That was no longer the question. The question now was what it meant for him. His fingers pressed lightly together again, then released, a subtle motion, but one that carried the weight of decision. "The integrity of this court," he said, his voice steady but quieter than before, "is not something that can be adjusted lightly." The statement was firm, but it no longer carried dismissal. It carried consequence. Emily listened without interruption. "And yet," she said after a brief pause, "it is something that must be upheld completely." The words did not challenge him. They aligned with him. And that alignment made them harder to reject. Harrington's eyes lifted again, meeting hers directly, and for a moment, neither spoke. The silence stretched, but it was no longer uncertain. It was precise. Measured. The kind of silence that exists when two people understand exactly what is at stake. A man in the gallery slowly removed his glasses, holding them in his hand without realizing it, his attention locked entirely on the exchange. A woman near the front straightened. Slightly, her earlier skepticism gone, replaced with something closer to quiet respect. Harrington exhaled slowly, the breath controlled, intentional, as he leaned forward once more. If the court were to accept your position, he said, choosing each word carefully, it would mean that the prior discretionary action cannot stand as issued. The statement hung in the air, not as a conclusion, but as a threshold. Emily's response came without hesitation. Yes, Your Honor. No added emphasis. No pressure. Just confirmation. The room did not react outwardly, but something deeper shifted again. Because now, it was no longer about whether she had proven her point. That had already begun to happen. This was about whether the man who had dismissed her minutes ago was willing to acknowledge it. And for the first time, that answer did not seem as certain as it once had. Harrington leaned back slightly, his gaze drifting for just a second, not toward the gallery, not toward the clerk, but somewhere inward, where decisions were made before they were spoken. And in that brief moment, the entire courtroom understood something without a single word being said. The balance had already changed. What remained, was whether he would admit it. The silence no longer belonged to uncertainty, it belonged to decision, and everyone in the courtroom could feel it settling into place. Judge Harrington remained still, his posture composed, but the authority that once filled the space around him now carried weight, not certainty. His gaze lowered once more to the document, though it was clear he was no longer reading for information. He was confirming what he already knew. The lines, the dates, the sequence, they had aligned too precisely to ignore. When he finally looked up again, the room seemed to hold its breath in unison. "Ms. Carter," he said, his voice steady, but quieter than it had been at the beginning, "the court acknowledges that the procedural record you have referenced exists." It was not a full concession. Not yet. But it was the first shift spoken aloud. A faint movement passed through the gallery, not sound, not reaction, just awareness spreading from one person to another. Emily Carter did not respond immediately. She simply listened, her expression unchanged, her calm presence now unmistakably grounded in something deeper than confidence. Harrington continued, choosing each word with care. "The question before this court," he said, "is whether that record materially alters the validity of the discretionary action taken." The phrasing mattered. It preserved structure. It preserved authority. But it also opened a door that had not existed minutes earlier. Emily inclined her head slightly. "It does," she said, her voice clear, steady, without hesitation. The directness of the answer landed differently now. There was no longer any sense that she was overstepping. Only that she was certain. Harrington's eyes remained fixed on her, searching, not for weakness, but for any sign that her certainty was misplaced. He found none. The clerk shifted again, this time leaning slightly forward, his voice careful but firm. "Your Honor, subsection C is explicit regarding prior inconsistencies," he said. "It does not provide discretion once those conditions are present." The addition, quiet as it was, carried weight. It was no longer just her argument. It was the record itself speaking. Harrington's jaw tightened, but not in resistance. In recognition. A man in the gallery slowly nodded, almost unconsciously, as if the logic had settled into place in his own mind. Another spectator lowered her gaze briefly, then looked back up, her expression changed, no longer skeptical, no longer dismissive. Harrington leaned back again, the chair creaking softly beneath him, the sound more noticeable in the stillness. For a moment, he said nothing. And in that moment, the entire courtroom understood something without needing it to be spoken. This was no longer about interpretation. It was about acknowledgement. When he finally spoke again, his voice carried something different. Not dominance. Not defense. But clarity. "If the court were to proceed under the current ruling," he said slowly, "it would be doing so without full adherence to its own procedural framework." The word settled heavily, unmistakably. Emily did not move. She did not react. She did not need to. Because the shift had already happened. And now, it was no longer a question of whether the truth had been revealed. It was a question of whether the man who had dismissed her would fully accept what he could no longer deny. The words hung in the air with a finality that no one could ignore, and for a brief moment, the courtroom existed in complete stillness, as if every person present understood that the next sentence would define everything that came before it. Judge Harrington remained seated, his posture composed, but the certainty that once framed his authority had fully transformed into something else, something more deliberate, more accountable. His gaze rested on the document one last time, not searching, not questioning, but confirming what had already become undeniable. When he lifted his eyes, they did not carry dismissal, and they did not carry doubt. They carried decision. This court, he began, his voice steady and controlled, cannot proceed under a ruling that does not fully align with its own procedural standards. The statement landed quietly, but its impact moved through the room like a shift in gravity. A subtle breath escaped somewhere in the gallery, not relief, not surprise, but recognition. Emily Carter did not react outwardly. She remained still, her presence unchanged, as if she had already understood where this would lead long before anyone else in the room had caught up. Harrington continued, his tone measured, precise. The discretionary action previously taken is therefore subject to reconsideration. The words were formal, structured, consistent with the weight of the bench, but they carried something more than procedure. They carried acknowledgement. The clerk nodded slightly, his pen moving again, this time with certainty, recording not just a statement, but a correction. Harrington paused briefly, his gaze shifting for a fraction of a second, not away from the room, but across it, as if aware of the silent audience that had witnessed every step of the unraveling. The court will suspend the current proceeding pending a full review of the procedural record, he added. Each word was deliberate, each phrase placed with care. Not as a retreat, but as a restoration. A man in the gallery leaned back slowly, his earlier assumptions completely gone, replaced by something quieter, more reflective. A woman near the front lowered her eyes briefly, then looked up again, her expression no longer skeptical, but thoughtful. Harrington's hands rested firmly on the bench now, steady, grounded, as if the weight he carried had shifted from defense to responsibility. Then, after a brief pause, he spoke again, and this time, his voice carried something that had not been present at any point before. "Ms. Carter," he said, looking directly at her, "your interpretation of the procedural framework is accurate." The room did not react immediately. It could not. Because the significance of what had just been said took a moment to fully settle. It was not just agreement. It was validation. Emily inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the statement, but not claiming it. She did not need to. The truth had already spoken for itself. Harrington held her gaze for a second longer, then looked down, the motion small but meaningful. And in that moment, the courtroom understood something deeper than the outcome of a single case. Authority, when confronted with truth, does not diminish by admitting it. It is defined by it. But even as the room began to settle into that realization, one question remained, unspoken but undeniable. If Emily Carter could dismantle a ruling so precisely, so completely, then who exactly had the judge called nobody just minutes before? The acknowledgement did not echo loudly, but it reshaped the entire room in a way no raised voice ever could. Judge Harrington's final words lingered in the air, not as an ending, but as a turning point that no one present could ignore. For a few seconds, no one moved. The clerk continued writing, but even the soft scratching of the pen seemed quieter, more deliberate, as if the act of recording the moment carried its own weight. Emily Carter remained still, her posture unchanged, her expression calm, as though nothing extraordinary had just happened. But everything had. In the gallery, the shift was unmistakable. People who had once leaned back with quiet amusement now sat upright, their attention fixed not on the judge, but on her. A man near the back slowly shook his head, not in disagreement, but in disbelief at how quickly the narrative had reversed. A woman in the front row folded her hands together, her eyes steady, no longer questioning who belonged in that room. Harrington adjusted slightly in his chair, a subtle movement, but one that no longer carried dominance. It carried awareness. His gaze moved once more toward Emily, but this time it was not measuring her. It was recognizing something he had missed. "The court will reconvene after review," he stated, his tone returning to formal structure, but the edge that once defined it was gone. The gavel lifted slightly, then paused for just a fraction of a second before coming down with a controlled, final tap. The sound echoed across the chamber, signaling adjournment, but not closure. Not entirely. As the room began to shift, chairs moving, quiet murmurs returning, there was still a center of gravity that had not moved. Emily gathered her documents slowly, aligning each page with the same precision she had shown from the beginning. No rush. No display. Just quiet control. The clerk glanced at her briefly, then looked away, as if unsure whether to say something or simply acknowledge what had already been understood. Harrington remained seated for a moment longer than necessary, his gaze following her movements, thoughtful, contained. Then, almost imperceptibly, he spoke again, not to the room, but to her. "Ms. Carter." The sound of her name cut gently through the growing noise. Emily paused, looking up, meeting his gaze once more. There was no tension now. No challenge. Just clarity. Harrington held that moment for a second, as if weighing whether to say more. Then he simply nodded. A small gesture. But meaningful. Respect, not spoken, but given. Emily returned the nod, just as small, just as controlled, and turned to leave. As she walked down the aisle, the same path where she had stood alone just minutes before, the eyes that followed her were no longer dismissive. They were different now. Observant. Curious. Respectful. And yet, as the doors at the back of the courtroom slowly opened and the light from the hallway stretched across the floor, one question lingered in the minds of everyone who had witnessed what had just happened. If she was capable of this, of dismantling a ruling with nothing but precision and calm, then what had she chosen to be before this moment, and more importantly, what had she chosen not to reveal? The courtroom doors closed softly behind Emily Carter, but the impact of what had just happened did not remain inside those walls. It followed her, carried in the quiet glances exchanged between strangers, in the subtle shift of posture from those who had witnessed the moment and could not quite return to what they were before. The hallway outside was long, lined with polished stone and muted lighting, the kind of space designed to feel formal, controlled, predictable. But as Emily stepped forward, her pace steady, her movements unhurried, it was clear that something about her did not belong to predictability. A man who had sat near the back of the courtroom exited a few steps behind her, his expression thoughtful, his earlier certainty replaced with something closer to reflection. He hesitated for a moment, as if considering whether to speak, then chose silence, allowing her to pass without interruption. Respect, unspoken, but understood. Emily reached the end of the corridor where a row of windows overlooked the city below, sunlight stretching across the floor in long, quiet lines. She paused briefly, not to admire the view, but to gather her papers once more, aligning them with the same careful precision she had shown throughout the hearing. Every movement intentional. Every detail controlled. Behind her, the courtroom doors opened again, and Judge Harrington stepped out, no longer framed by the elevated bench, no longer separated by distance or structure. Here, in the open hallway, he looked different. Still composed. Still authoritative. But human in a way the courtroom had not allowed. He stopped a few feet away, his gaze settling on her, not with hesitation, but with consideration. "Ms. Carter," he said, his voice quieter now, free of the echo that had once amplified it. Emily turned slightly, meeting his gaze without surprise. "Your Honor." The exchange was simple, but it carried weight, not of conflict, but of recognition. Harrington studied her for a moment, as if recalibrating everything he thought he understood. "You prepared thoroughly," he said. It was not a question. Emily gave a small nod. "Yes." He exhaled slowly, the breath controlled, thoughtful. "Most people would not have seen that," he continued. Emily's expression remained calm. It was in the record, she replied. Again, the simplicity. Again, the clarity that left no room for exaggeration. Harrington's gaze shifted briefly to the papers in her hands, then back to her. That is not what I meant, he said. There was no frustration in his tone. Only honesty. For a brief moment, neither spoke. The noise of the building moved around them, distant footsteps, quiet conversations, the low hum of activity continuing as if nothing had changed. But something had. Harrington nodded once, a small gesture, but deliberate. You presented your argument well, he said. The words were measured, but genuine. Emily acknowledged them with the same calm composure she had shown from the beginning. Thank you. No more. No less. And yet, as the moment settled, it became clear that what had happened in that courtroom was not simply a correction of a ruling. It was a shift in perception. Because the woman who had walked in unnoticed, had walked out leaving a question behind that no one could easily answer. And as Harrington turned to leave, his steps slower than before, one thought lingered in his mind, quiet but persistent. If Emily Carter had chosen to remain invisible until now, then what had she been capable of all along? The hallway gradually returned to its normal rhythm, footsteps echoing softly, voices blending into a low, distant hum, but something subtle had changed in the way people moved, in the way they looked at one another, as if they had all witnessed something they could not quite explain but would not forget. Emily Carter continued walking toward the exit, her pace steady, her posture unchanged, her presence as quiet as it had been when she first arrived. Yet now, the space around her felt different, not because she demanded attention, but because attention followed her without effort. A security officer standing near the door straightened slightly as she approached, offering a small nod that carried more respect than formality. She returned it just as simply and stepped outside into the afternoon light, the city stretching before her in familiar silence. Inside, Judge Harrington remained in the corridor for a moment longer than necessary, his gaze lingering where she had just stood, as if trying to reconcile the image of the woman he had dismissed with the reality of the one who had just walked away. His steps were slower as he turned back toward his chambers, not hesitant, but thoughtful, each movement carrying the quiet weight of reflection. The courtroom behind him had already begun preparing for the next case, files being arranged, chairs repositioned, the system continuing as it always did. But for those who had been present, the memory of what had unfolded remained, not as a disruption, but as a correction that could not be unseen. Later that evening, long after the building had quieted and the last of the day's proceedings had been recorded, Harrington sat alone at his desk, the same document resting in front of him. The lines had not changed. The dates had not shifted. But the way he saw them had. He read them again, slower this time, not searching for error, but understanding the sequence with clarity he had overlooked before. A faint exhale escaped him, controlled, measured, as he leaned back slightly, his eyes drifting toward the window where the last light of the day reflected against the glass. There was no anger in his expression. No frustration. Only recognition.